No better way to end it up than be here for our Wednesday night Bible study. Let's begin with the word of prayer. OZ, would you lead us in prayer, please? Tonight we're going to look at an individual in the New Testament that often is overlooked, and yet his name is mentioned several times, and that would be the man by the name of Apollos. And we might think he's just another one of those Bible characters that the Bible mentions a couple of times, and just maybe to fill a page, but that's not really the case, because he had a big name in the early church. If you were in the early church and you were to mention his name, people would know right off who you were talking about because of his work with the early church. He was not an apostle, but he was right underneath an apostle. If you were to put him in categories, if you were to look at church history, you would find his name there as well. But he is one that was very important when it came to teaching truth, spreading the truth, and having an influence over individuals. One place that we find him is in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 12. The church at Corinth was having a problem. They were about to split, and they were about to split 4 ways. And one of those ways would have been with Apollos. Here Paul says, 1:12 of 1 Corinthians, "Now I say this, that each of you says, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I am of Cephas, or I am of Christ." They thought very highly of Apollos. And here was a group that were willing to go out here, it seems like, and start the church of Apollos. That's what they were wanting to do. So you can see by that alone, he had quite a bit of influence over individuals of the church there at Corinth. So there were some that were willing to start a congregation after Apollos, some after Paul, and some after Cephas or Peter there. And believe it or not, some after Christ. Some were going to try to do that. And Paul in 1 Corinthians, a couple of times, as we'll see, he's trying to put an end to that, trying to show them that we're just men. You don't need to start a following after us. Don't call your church after us. Understand who it is, the real one that's important here, and that is Christ. But still to have this kind of popularity shows that Apollos wasn't just an average person, maybe in the congregation. He had some of those who thought very highly of him. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, we begin something here where Paul brings up Apollos again. The church was not maturing as Paul had hoped. He hoped that they would be more mature by this time, but they were not. We see what we saw in chapter 1. They're trying to divide. And then what we see here, another problem. Chapter 3 and verse 1. "And I, brethren, could not speak to you as to spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ. I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it. And even now you are still not able, for you are still carnal. For where there are envy, strife, and division among you, are you not carnal and behaving like mere men?" So Paul addresses here. There's divisions. He's already mentioned 4 in chapter 1. In chapter 3 and verse 4 through 6, he says this: For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul? And who is Apollos? But ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So Paul is trying to get across to them. He says, me and Apollos, we're just ministers. I planted, Apollos watered, but God is the one that gives the increase here. So he's trying to get that across to them, who he is. Apollos was a minister, as he puts it through right here to the church at Corinth, just a minister. So no doubt they loved Apollos, but Christ is trying to get across, Paul is trying to get across to them, you need to love Christ more. He is to be the one you are to follow, not me, not Peter, and not Apollos. And Apollos would certainly agree with this. He would agree with it easily. Now, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 3. So then, neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now, he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive their own reward according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. So Paul continues to show that he and Apollos are just laborers. They're workers, fellow workers. They're not against each other, but they were fellow workers. And of course, Apollos would agree with Paul on this. Do not start a congregation here by my name or anybody else's name. It's to carry that of Christ, his name. So here, Apollos, he's mentioned among some pretty well-known people of in the New Testament. Peter and Paul, some others. Now, in chapter 16, we find him mentioned again. Now, concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren, but he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. So Paul wanted him to go sooner. I asked Apollos to go, but Apollos says, I'm not going. He was unwilling to go. And the word unwilling here, it's not a word of rebellion. No, I'm not going. It's not a word that, well, I'll go when my schedule is right. It's nothing like that. When the time is right, is what Apollos is saying, what he told Paul, I will go. So apparently Apollos knew something. He knew something about this division that was working in the church. And he didn't want to go there, and all of a sudden they make him a congregation under his name. He didn't want that. He knew they were carnal, as Paul said. He knew they were babes still in Christ. He knew they needed more teaching. And I think it says quite some good words here for Apollos to say, when the time is right, I will go. So Paul had to go there first, at least get this letter to them, explain to them about the role that Apollos had. And then when they understood that, when they got this division out of their blood, then Apollos would go and he would begin to help them to understand the word and help them to be more grounded, is what he was wanting. So that says a lot of Apollos. He could have gone up there and just destroyed the whole thing. But he knew there was a time for his going. And of course, if we look at Proverbs chapter 6, chapter 6, mainly verse 19, things that God hates, things that make him sick. One who sows discord among brethren. Apollos was not going to go and sow discord. He wasn't going to do that. So again, that says great words for Apollos and making sure that this is right. He didn't want to have the name of Diotrephes. 3 John 1 and verse 9. John says, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among you does not receive us. Apollos didn't want that. He didn't want his name to take the place of Diotrephes. He didn't want the people to think that he wanted preeminence, and he could have had some. He could have gone into Corinth, and he could have got his own movement started. But he didn't want that. Diotrephes did. And Diotrephes caused John a lot of problems. But Apollos was not that. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 1, Paul says, let a man so consider us. He's talking about him and Apollos. This is still the topic. So let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. So he's telling them, don't just think of us as being stewards, servants. That's a good thing how we're to be thought of, he said. And in verse 6, now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. So he tells them, don't go beyond what is written. You keep it in line here. Don't get puffed up over this thing. Don't get mad, get your feelings hurt, all this kind of stuff. You be united. You come together in the name of Christ, and you be as one. You be as one as they should be. So we see Paul is spoken very highly of in 1 Corinthians about Paul giving these words. But how did he get such a good name? How did that come about? He had to have a start somewhere. And we find him in Acts 18 and verse 24 and 25. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and talked accurately the things of the Lord, though he knew only the baptism of John. So here we find he was a Jew. He was eloquent. He was mighty in the Scriptures. That would have been the Old Testament Scriptures. He had been instructed. Now, somebody taught him at some point, because he knew of John's baptism, but that's all he knew. He didn't know of the baptism that came after the cross, the baptism for the remission of sins. He didn't know of that. So here he is. He's out there teaching, and he was fervent in how he taught. And he talked accurately a lot of things, but he only knew the baptism of John. And it may very well be that he didn't know that Christ had come. Maybe he didn't know that. Maybe he didn't know that Christ had died, that Christ had resurrected, that the church had started, that this new baptism was being taught. He didn't know those things. So, he's going to be taught here in a little bit. Maybe he didn't know about the miraculous gifts, how they were going about, and those who had the miraculous gifts, the apostles, who they gave them to. Maybe he didn't know about that. But he didn't know about the baptism of John, how he was taught, who taught him, we don't know. But he was teaching a lot of truth, but he wasn't teaching entire truth. And then in verse 26, at Acts 18, so he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. So he's teaching. He's in the synagogues. Aquila and Priscilla, the husband and wife team, Christians, they hear this and they realize this man's not quite right as far as what he's teaching. And they took him aside. That's very important. They took him aside. While he was in the synagogue, that wasn't the right time or the right place to confront him about this. They took him aside one-on-one and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And that's where they may have told him, Christ has already come. He has died. He was buried. He was raised the third day. And he knew those scriptures. Apollos knew those scriptures. He just didn't know they had been fulfilled, if that be the case here. So they taught him these things, and he began teaching more accurately. Now he knew. So he begins really teaching at this time. There's nothing mentioned about Apollos being rebaptized. I'm sure he was baptized under John's baptism. There was no need for him to be rebaptized. We're not going to look at it tonight, but in chapter 19, we find that there were some of John's disciples there that had to be rebaptized because they were baptized with John's baptism after the cross. So they were baptized the right way in water, but for the wrong reason. And it makes a difference. Many don't see it that way. And sad to say, there are many Christians who don't see it that way. They think one baptism is as good as another. If a person's just been baptized, that's good. Well, why is that person being baptized? That makes a difference. And it's got to be for the remission of sins, for it to be a scriptural baptism. That's important. But there's no mention here of Apollos being rebaptized. There was no need in it. He knew he was baptized under John's baptism, and all was good. So here's a man he's very, very educated, very elegant in his speech, mighty in the scriptures, and yet he still was humble enough to listen to somebody who was teaching him something different. Teaching him, here's the correct way that this is to be taught. He could have easily said, I'm not going to listen to you. Who are you? I was there with John and listened to him, and he could have easily done that, but he didn't do it. He was willing to learn. Whatever his age was, he was willing to learn more. And that says great, great words about him, being wanting to do that. And then in verse 27 of Acts 18, and when he desired to cross to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, showing from the scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. Now he knows. Now he's got the full picture. Jesus is the Christ. He's the one that these scriptures talked about. He's the one that fulfilled them. He's the one that died. He's the one now in heaven. He's the one that's coming back. He fulfilled all that. Tell him all that. He didn't say he's coming in the future. No, he has already come. He's coming again, I'm sure he taught them. So he did a great work. Once he got the understanding and the knowledge, he was a great disciple, a great minister, a great servant. And that's why he's mentioned as he is several times as we see. And that's why maybe the church at Corinth wanted to make him, let's start a church after him. Look at this guy. Look what he's saying, what he's doing. But that got refuted quickly. So what can we learn from Apollos? There's several things. First of all, one can be sincerely mistaken. Sincerely mistaken. Before Aquila and Priscilla came to Apollos or heard him, he believed he was right. He believed everything he was teaching was correct. But it wasn't. Not everything was correct. And of course, those Aquila and Priscilla more accurately taught him. So by doing that, we can see that one can be sincerely mistaken. People today can be sincerely mistaken. They may have a lot of truth, but it may be one or two things or whatever it may be that they're mistaken in. They just haven't seen the Scriptures, or that part of the Scriptures have been pointed out to them. And again, there's opportunity that we would have to do that. Hopefully, if some things that we believe and we're maybe it's not correct, hopefully we would have the same attitude as Apollos had. Open to understanding, open to learning more, appreciate truth. So one can be sincerely mistaken. And there are many out there in religion who are. They're sincere about what they believe, but they are mistaken. Another thing we can learn, one can teach part of the truth and not the whole truth. Apollos could tell you everything about the prophets. He could quote them, no problem. He could tell you everything about the coming of the church, what that's going to be about, when it was going to happen. He could tell you that. He could tell you about how to love your neighbor. He could tell you about all the good attributes of God. But he didn't have the whole truth. He couldn't tell you what to do to be saved. He couldn't do that until after he was taught. If you came to Apollos, what must I do to be saved? He couldn't tell you that accurately, not all of it. So, every Sunday, in many different church buildings all over this world, you hear people from maybe the denominational places that give good lessons. I've heard some good lessons taught by some of them. And then it gets to maybe to the last part, the plan of salvation, and what happens? They don't teach it correctly. Maybe everything they say maybe about Christ is true. But what must I do to be saved? Just believe. Just say the sinner's prayer. That's not the whole truth. So again, one can teach part of the truth, but also not the whole truth. So again, we got to be aware of that. Apollos is a good example of it. Another thing, zeal doesn't guarantee God's approval. Apollos had a lot of zeal. He was fervent in the Spirit. But just being a very zealous person, fervent, again, that's a good trait to have. But just because a person is powerful in their voice and what they say and how they teach doesn't always make it true. And we got to be aware of that. There's some very good speakers out there who can really do an excellent way of teaching certain things. But then again, not everything they will say is correct. And people have a hard time distinguishing between the two. But zeal doesn't guarantee God's approval. Another thing we learn from Apollos is we are to love the truth. Love truth. John 17:17, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. Apollos was open to the truth because he wanted to know truth. And once he heard it, he believed it, and he taught it. How important is truth when it comes to going to a doctor? You want him to be truthful. How important is it when it comes to how important is truth in a marriage? Very important. You've got to be honest with one another. How important is truth when it comes to religion? Well, that's very important. But yet many will say on that line, doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you're sincere. Well, we need to be those who love truth. Apollos loved the truth. And then the last one, just because something was once true doesn't mean it will always be true. It was once true that Jesus was coming to die for us. That once was true. It's not true today because he's already come. He's already died. It once was true that Christ was going to establish his church. That once was true. It's not true today because he's already established his church. It's here. That's why the Lord's Prayer, one little phrase in there that we need to understand, where he said, talking about the kingdom, thy kingdom come. Well, it's already here. It'd be about like us praying today, Lord, we're sure looking forward to your church when it's established. Looking forward to it coming. No, that's wrong. It's here. It's already here. Animal sacrifices once were right, but not anymore. They burned incense. That once was true, but not today. We don't do that. Speaking in tongues once was a part of the early church, but not today. Miracles was once a part of the early church and how the men could go and do these miracles, but not today. So just because something was once true doesn't mean it's always true. You've got to search that out the scriptures and see, has it ended? Has it already been fulfilled? And understand that. Apollos, a great man, a great Christian. And a lot of things we can learn from his life. Not just another name to fill the pages, but a name that we can learn from and live by even today. Even today. Anything on Apollos? All right, next week I think we'll look at Zacchaeus, the little man that climbed up the tree to get to see Christ. He'll be our topic next week. All right, we'll conclude here.